New Battlefronts, Rebirth of a Culture. As we have seen, the persistence of Indian communities, the basis of the Mexico Profundo, has been possible thanks to their ability to keep their own cultures. This necessarily implies a historical process that actualized Mesoamerican civilization or brought it into the present. It is there, in those cultures forced to emphasize their mechanisms of resistance, that the profound vitality of Mexico glows. The dynamic relationship between the forces of domination and those of liberation constantly generates new forms of struggle and new spaces in dispute. One of the most notable phenomena has been the emergence of forms of political organization that produce other types of leaders, whose discourse and arsenal of tactics are not present in the daily struggles within the communities. Many of the Indian political organizations that emerged at the beginning of the 1970s were adopted by the state in an effort to create defined and institutionalized groups that would speak for the Indian world. At the time, there was an intensification of conflicts with the communities, principally over land, and there was a need to reinforce the legitimacy of a government that had been severely questioned in 1968. These factors made it advisable to try to create an Indian organization that would accept dialogue under the terms required by the government. As a result, then, of the First Congress of Indian Peoples, held in Pátzcuaro in 1975, the National Council of Indian Peoples, CNPI, was created. It was composed of several dozen executive councils, which were to represent the different ethnic groups. Indirectly, the CNPI also brought about the rise of parallel organizations, independent of the government, tied in some cases to opposition political parties, or, in other cases, completely autonomous. Along with government efforts to create an Indian spokesperson, the consequences of other processes that had been maturing for years emerged, giving birth to new actors in Indian affairs. It will be remembered that one of the indigenista strategies of revolutionary governments since the 1930s had been to train youth from the Indian communities, to convert them into agents of de-Indianization. The fact is that many teachers and cultural promoters, disillusioned with the original cause, began to picture an alternative project of Indian education. In that effort, with its highs and lows and contradictions, its successes and failures, the Indian teachers have begun outlining a sort of school education that they regard as their own. They want education to be more inclusive, and they have undertaken the task of giving it a content of their own, in which Indian languages and cultures occupy a place next to Spanish and universal culture. The expansion of higher education has permitted Indian students to filter upward in different career fields. In the last few years, then, a new Indian sector has been created. This new group is necessarily composed of individuals who say they are Indians, but who, in general, participate only sporadically in communal affairs. They are a new urban presence on the national scene. They are a political presence. Their actions reach beyond the local borders of their communities, without their having to renounce their origin or the cultures from which they come. An argument that has been employed to label the urban Indian movement as spurious is the assertion that its representatives are no longer Indians. In this case, one must suppose that the only true Indian is one who is illiterate and miserably poor, and who does not speak Spanish or employ Western rationality. Anyone who does these things ceases to be Indian. Can there be a clearer example of the persistence of colonial ideology? The new forms of struggle are also encountered on other levels. In some communities, commerce, which had been in the hands of Ladinos, had been slowly recovered by local people. In its extreme form, the process leads to the expulsion of the inhabitants who are not Indian and the re-Indianization of the geographic area. There are important instances of organizations that produce and commercialize handicrafts. This process nearly always includes the recovery of techniques, raw materials, and traditional motifs that had fallen into disuse through the pressures of a voracious and degrading commerce. Another order of activities that should be mentioned is the appearance of an Indian press. It is still very incipient and unstable, but it points toward the appropriation of the printed word, something that has remained foreign to Indian cultures. The possibility of publishing texts in indigenous languages has stimulated the creation of the necessary alphabets, as well as the recovery of oral tradition and the beginning of a new Indian literature. An example is the magazine Gukachi Reza, published by the full council, Ayuntamiento Popular of Fujitan. The artistic movements in theater, music, and dance that have been initiated in various Indian regions are always based on the recovery of their own traditions. However, they frequently make use of new elements and resources that have been appropriated and that aim to create new and different forms of expression to extend the cultural space of community culture. In the area of religious confrontation, the requirement of respecting tradition has been the point of rupture with those converted to different sorts of Protestantism. For example, some communities in Chiapas have been so deeply divided that the Protestant families have left their home to form new communities in other places, especially in the jungle. What happens to them? What happens to their culture and their previous identity? Do they stop being Tzatziles? Do they stop being Indians? The imposition of a new religion does not necessarily imply a change in ethnic identity or a rupture in cultural and historical continuity, as irrefutably demonstrated by the spiritual conquest of Mesoamerica. This would be the case if their members were to appropriate the new religion and insert it, with modifications, into the matrix of their own culture, as happened centuries ago with Catholicism. At this point, what predominates seems to be an attitude of total rejection of the past, but one cannot make a tabula rasa of the past, nor replace one's own culture from one day to the next. This process, with its current characteristics, is too new to be able to draw conclusions about final effects. It is worth remembering that in the first half of the 16th century, there were groups of fanatical Indian youth who had been indoctrinated by the friars. They dedicated themselves to destroying the sacred images venerated by their elders and denouncing the heresies of their own parents. Those living through those times, particularly the friars, certainly believed that it was the beginning of the end for Mesoamerican civilization. Time very quickly proved them wrong. In conclusion, it should be pointed out that the recent transformations of Mexican society have affected Indian peoples in different ways and have provoked new responses in various aspects of life. Along with traditional resistance, which has not been abandoned and whose existence cannot be denied, new initiatives have arisen to recover and modernize Indian cultures. New Indian actors are involved in them, within their own communities and in the broader spheres of national urban life. Many of these movements are not related among themselves, and at times they are explicitly and implicitly contradictory. But, put in a broader perspective, they constitute a proof of the vitality and viability of Mesoamerican civilization in modern Mexico.